In the spring of 2011, every cattleman in Harding County, New Mexico, did the same thing when the grass stopped coming back. They called the hay broker. They bought in feed, they reduced their herd numbers, and took whatever price the sale barn was offering that week, which was never a good price, because everyone was selling at the same time for the same reason. And they did it without a second thought, because that is what you did in Harding County when the range went dry. Destocking was not a decision, it was reflex. It was the same as weaning calves in October and shipping steers in November and watching the price board at the co-op in Mosquero and feeling grateful for whatever number appeared above your breed. Nobody questioned destocking the way nobody questions closing a window when it rains. You did it because your father did it, and the range consultant from the NRCS office recommended it, and the bank in Roy was full of people who had not destocked fast enough and were now explaining themselves across a desk, all of them doing the same thing, none of them asking whether the thing they were doing was the reason the grass kept not coming back. Let me tell you about what Harding County looked like in 2011, because you need to understand the land before you can understand what one 54-year-old woman did to it. The county ran from the Canadian River breaks in the south up through 80 miles of shortgrass mesa and piñons draws to the Colorado border. The ranches were large because the land demanded it. You needed 30 to 50 acres per animal unit in a decent year, and in a drought year, you needed more than you had. The grass was blue grama and buffalo grass and sidiotes grama on flats with a little black grama in the draws, and when it was right, it was the most efficient livestock forage in North America, short and dense and extraordinarily deep-rooted and capable of going dormant in August and coming back in September as if the summer had been a misunderstanding. When it was right, it had not been right for going on 6 years. The Alderman Ranch sat 14 miles east of Mosquero on a county road that turned to Kalish after the pavement ended. Gwen Alderman had run it alone since her husband Ray died in 2007 for 200 acres of deeded ground and another 1,800 acres of state lease, carrying a cow-calf herd that had numbered 180 pairs when Ray was alive and had been reduced to 110 pairs by 2011, because that was what the consultant said you did. She was 54 years old. She had grown up on this land, her family's land before it was hers and Ray's, and she understood the grass the way you understand something you have watched your whole life with nothing between you and it. She had also spent 3 years reading everything she could find about something called adaptive multi-paddock grazing. She had read it in the way you read something that makes the hairs on your arm stand up, slowly and more than once, going back to mark passages and write questions in the margins, and then looking out the window at her pastures and seeing them differently than she had seen them before. She had a proposal. In Harding County in 2011, it was the kind of proposal that made people go quiet in a particular way. She did not want to destock further. That was the beginning of it, and that was the thing that made no sense to anyone who heard it, because the range was in the 3rd year of a serious drought, and the grass was so short in places you could see the caliche between the plants. Every rancher with eyes could see that the land was over her carrying capacity. Every consultant in the state was telling her the same thing. Give the grass a chance to recover. Give the grass a chance to. Gwen did not believe the grass was failing because there were too many cattle. She believed the grass was failing because the cattle were grazing it the wrong way. The difference sounds academic until you understand what she meant. The traditional grazing model in Harding County was continuous. Cattle spread across a pasture and grazed it day after day, month after month, returning to the same plants before those plants had time to recover, biting them down again before the roots had rebuilt their energy reserves. until the perennial grasses weakened and the annuals and the bare ground moved in to replace them. You could reduce cattle numbers and slow that process, but you could not reverse it, because even 50 cattle grazing continuously on a weakened pasture would keep regrazing the same recovering plants. What Gwen had been reading about was different. You moved cattle in large groups through small paddocks on short grazing periods followed by long rest periods. You mimicked, in a rough way, the movement patterns of the bison herds that had shaped these grasses over thousands of years. The grass got grazed hard and then left completely alone for 90 to 120 days, long enough to recover, to push down energy into the roots, to rebuild the density that held soil and captured rain and kept the bare ground from expanding. You did not reduce the impact. You concentrated it and then removed it entirely. She had the research. She had Alan Savory's work from Zimbabwe. She had the Kachana Station data from Australia. She had 3 peer-reviewed studies from the Chihuahua Desert that showed statistically significant differences in perennial grass cover between adaptive multi-paddock systems and continuous systems after 5-year drought sequences. She had contacted a rancher in the Texas Panhandle who had been running the system for 8 years and driven out to walk his pastures and look at his grasses with her own eyes. What she wanted to do was divide her 4 main pastures into 22 smaller paddocks using temporary electric fencing. She wanted to move her cattle through those paddocks on a rotation that would give each paddock a minimum of 90 days of rest. She wanted to keep her herd at 110 pairs, not reduce it further, and she wanted to do this during the worst drought Harding County had seen in 15 years. She brought this to the dining room table on a Sunday evening in February of 2011, a week after she had come back from the Texas Panhandle with a notebook full of photographs and measurements. She spread the maps and the fencing diagrams and the grazing charts across the table next to the salt shaker and her coffee cup, and walked her son-in-law, Curtis Bale, through it while her daughter Nora stood at the kitchen counter and listened without appearing to listen. Curtis Bale was 38 years old and had been married to Nora for 11 years and had worked the Alderman Ranch since before Ray died. He was a capable man, a hard worker, good with cattle and machinery and fence. He was not a man who read range ecology journals. He was a man who knew what he had seen, and what he had seen for 6 years was grass that was not coming back, and what everyone he trusted had told him was that the grass was not coming back because there were too many cattle on it. Curtis heard her out. He did not interrupt. He looked at the maps and the fencing diagrams. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Gwen, that's a lot of fence to build in a drought." He said it not unkindly. He said it the way you state a concern that you believe is self-evident. Gwen said, "I know it's a lot of fence. That's not the argument against it." Curtis looked at the grazings charts. He picked up one of the research papers and looked at it without reading it. He set it down. "The NRCS man said we should be at 80 pairs by fall. I know what he said." Nora, still at the counter, said quietly, "She's been looking at this for 3 years, Curtis." She did not say anything else. She refilled her coffee cup. Curtis looked at his wife's back and then looked at the maps and then looked at his coffee. He did not say yes, but he did not call the sale barn. Let me tell you about the conversation that happened 6 weeks later, because it is the reason this story has the shape it has. Gwen had made the mistake, or perhaps it was not a mistake, perhaps it was simply inevitable, of describing her plan to Wade Spurlock at the Mosquero feed store on a Tuesday morning when she had come in to price salt blocks. Wade Spurlock was 61 years old and had been selling livestock supplies and range supplements to Harding County ranchers for 28 years. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had watched drought cycles come and go and had developed very clear ideas about what worked and what did not work, and those ideas had calcified in the way that ideas calcify in men who have been right often enough to stop questioning themselves. Gwen had not meant to get into it with him. She had mentioned the paddock rotation system offhandedly, the way you mention something you've been thinking about, and Wade had looked at her over the counter with the particular expression of a man recalibrating his estimate of a person's judgment. "Adaptive grazing," he said. He said it the way you repeat a phrase back to confirm you've heard it correctly, with a faint tonal distance that communicated everything. "Rotational paddocks," Gwen said. 60 to 90-day rest periods. Keep the herd at 110. The silence lasted about 3 seconds. Then Wade Spurlock shook his head slowly, and the two ranchers who were standing near the supplement display looked at each other with the small sideways glance of men who are trying not to smile. Wade said, "Gwen, I've been selling to this county for 28 years. I've seen range consultants come out here with university ideas about how to graze this country, and I've seen those ideas go back to the university where they came from." He picked up his pen. "You want to keep 110 cows on ground that can't carry 60 right now, you're going to lose cattle. I don't care what they're doing in Zimbabwe." He paused. He was not smiling exactly. He was wearing the expression of a man who has already seen the outcome and is mildly sorry about it. "You talked to the NRCS office lately?" "Well, it was my decision," Gwen said. "Let me know when you need to move those pairs in a hurry because the sale barn schedule fills up fast in a drought year, and I'd hate for you to be calling late. Now let me stop and ask you something. Have you ever been in a room where the people around you were so certain you were wrong that their certainty felt like gravity? Not argument. Certainty, the kind that doesn't bother to argue because it doesn't believe argument is necessary." Gwen Alderman was 54 years old, and she was standing in a feed store in the county where she had ranched for 30 years. The man behind the counter was not angry at her. He was not trying to be unkind. He was simply so certain that she was wrong that her alternative did not register to him as a real option. She had 3 years of research and a notebook full of data from ranches that had turned dying pastures back into productive land. She had walked those pastures herself. She had seen the grass. None of it mattered to Wade Spurlock because she was a widow running her late husband's ranch on ideas from a range ecologist in Zimbabwe, and in Harding County in 2011, that combination did not purchase the benefit of the doubt. She did not argue. She bought her salt blocks and loaded them in the truck and drove the 14 miles back to the ranch on the Kalish Road. She sat in the truck for a few minutes before she went inside. That evening, she called the temporary fencing supplier in Tucumcari and ordered 12,000 feet of polywire and 200 step-in posts. Curtis Bale watched her unload the fencing supplies from the truck the following week. He helped her carry them to the barn without saying anything. That evening at the table, he said, "I'll help you build it, but I want it on record that I think we're going to regret this." Gwen looked at him. She said, "Noted." He almost smiled. He did not quite make it. But he picked up the fencing diagram and started asking questions about the paddock layout, and the questions were the real answer. Let me tell you about the summer of 2011, because it was the first chapter of a proof that nobody in Harding County was ready to read. Gwen and Curtis built the paddock system in March, stringing polywire and step-in posts across 4 pastures to create 22 paddocks averaging 85 acres each. The work took 3 weeks, and Gwen's hands were cut from the wire by the end of it. They moved the cattle into Paddock 1 on April 3rd and ran them at a density Gwen had calculated from the Texas Panhandle data, higher than any of her neighbors would have believed sensible, and on April 10th they moved them to Paddock 2. The cattle were confused at first, cattle that have grazed continuously. do not understand the concept of a fence that exists to protect grass rather than to contain them. They walked the polywire looking for a way through for the first day or two in each new paddock. Then they settled and grazed, and because the paddocks were small and the cattle were many, they grazed efficiently, taking the grass down to a consistent height across the entire paddock rather than overgrazing the areas near water and leaving the far corners untouched, which is what continuous grazers do. The drought continued. June was dry. July was drier. The blue grama on the continuously grazed land around Mosquero went the color of old straw, and the bare ground between plants expanded. People were destocking. The sale barn in Clayton was running extra days to handle the volume. On the Alderman ranch, something was happening in the paddocks that had completed their rest period. The grass was not lush, it was a drought, and Gwen was not going to pretend the rain that wasn't falling. But in the paddocks that had been grazed in April and left alone since, the blue grama was greener than the continuously grazed range around it. The plants were upright. There was less bare ground between them. The soil in those paddocks held the occasional thunderstorm rain for hours rather than sheeting off immediately, because the root systems had maintained enough structure to slow the water. Gwen photographed each paddock on the first of every month, the same angle and the same distance, and she recorded the photos in a 3-ring binder with dates and rainfall totals and grazing days written in the margins in her handwriting. The cattle were maintaining their weight. That was the number that mattered most to the bank, and by September the cattle were maintaining weight on ground that her neighbors said could not carry them, and they were doing it without supplemental hay, which Gwen could not entirely have afforded anyway. She ran the herd at 110 pairs through the entire summer of 2011. She did not call the sale barn. She did not buy and feed. She moved cattle every 7 to 10 days, and she watched the rested paddocks come back in the way that things come back when they are given genuine time and genuine rest, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a quality of returning that felt different from the stubborn stasis of the surrounding range. In the fall, she weaned calves that were heavier than the previous year's calves had been, which was not supposed to be possible in the 3rd year of a drought. She did not tell anyone the weaning weights. She wrote them in the binder and went back to moving fence. Let me tell you about what happened at the feed store that winter, because it is a small thing and also not a small thing. Wades per herd through the network of information that connects every ranching operation in a small county that Gwen Alderman had not destocked, had not bought hay, and had weaned a decent calf crop. He did not say anything about it publicly. When her name came up at the table in the back of the store where the ranchers gathered on cold mornings, he said that one season didn't prove anything, that she'd gotten lucky with her paddock timing, that the system would fail when the drought went another year. He said it with the authority of 28 years behind the counter, and the men at the table nodded because Wade Spurlock had been right about most things for most of their ranching lives, and one decent fall from a widow on a system from Zimbabwe was not enough to overturn that. The 2012 season was drier than 2011. Gwen adjusted her rotation to give paddocks 110 days of rest instead of 90 during the worst of the summer. She reduced grazing days per paddock to 5 in July and August. She was not rigid about the system because the system was not a formula. It was a way of reading the grass and responding to what the grass told her. Dr. Garrett's counterpart in her reading was a researcher named Tatum Ozel at New Mexico State, who had spent 20 years studying adaptive grazing in semi-arid grasslands, and what Tatum Ozel's work had taught her was that the system succeeded when the manager watched the land more carefully than they watched the calendar. She watched the land. The 2012 weaning weights were lower than 20. She lost 3 cows to the drought, 2 of them old cows she would have culled anyway, and 1 younger cow that simply could not hold condition. She did not hide this from the binder. She wrote it down with the date and the weight and the reason, because the binder was not a record of her successes. It was a record of the land. Her paddock photographs from 2012 showed something that she had not fully expected and that she spent 3 evenings studying at the dining room table. The paddocks that had now completed 2 full cycles of intense grazing, followed long rest, were fibrous denser than they had been in the spring of 2011. The perennial grass plants were larger. There were more of them per square foot. The bare ground between plants, which was the number that range ecologists use to measure the health of a shortgrass system, had decreased measurably in the paddocks with the most completed cycles. The drought was continuing. The grass was recovering. She wrote to Tatum Ozell at NMSU and included copies of her paddock photographs with dates and rainfall records. Tatum Ozell wrote back in 2 days, "Let me tell you about the summer of 2013, because that is when the proof stopped being something she could keep to herself. The drought in eastern New Mexico in 2013 was the worst in 40 years. It arrived, as droughts do in that country, not with a single dramatic moment, but with an accumulation of absences. No snow in the mountains in December, no rain in March, a hot, dry wind in May that took the soil moisture the blue grama needed to break dormancy, and by June it was clear that the county was in serious trouble. The ranches that had been continuously grazed through the drought years were in crisis. Range that had been marginal in 2011 was bare in 2013. Ranchers who had destocked to 60 pairs were destocking again to 30, to 20. One family 8 miles west of Mosquero walked away from a lease they had held for 40 years because they could not justify the carrying cost on land that could not carry anything. The NRCS office was processing emergency assistance applications and hosting meetings about long-term range recovery that everybody knew meant the range was not going to recover for a long time. The Alderman ranch was not fine. Gwen was not going to pretend the rain was falling. But the Alderman ranch was not in crisis. The paddocks in their 3rd full cycle of adaptive grazing were holding. The blue grama in those paddocks was not green in July of 2013 because blue grama does not stay green in July of a drought year. But the plants were alive and upright, and the soil between them was not bare caliche. It was dark with organic matter and covered with the fine litter of previous season's grass, which held what little moisture fell and kept the soil from crusting in the heat. The cattle were thinner than Gwen wanted. She reduced to 90 pairs in July, the first time she had sold cattle since she started the system, and she sold the bottom of the herd, the thinner cows, and the older cows, which is a different decision than panic destocking. She moved the remaining pairs through the rotation with rest periods extended to 130 days in the worst paddocks. She bought 1 load of supplement cubes in August. She wrote that in the binder. Her neighbor to the north, a man named Lyle Trescott, who had ranched 6,000 acres for 35 years, called her in September. He had just shipped his last 40 pairs. He was running cattle on land that could not feed them, and he was going to let the pastures rest completely through the winter and hope for spring. He asked her what she was doing over there. She told him. She invited him to come walk the paddocks. He came on a Thursday morning and walked for 2 hours without saying much. He looked at the grass in the paddocks that had been resting since May. He looked at the soil. He got down on one knee in paddock 14, which was in its 3rd rest cycle, and he dug his fingers into the ground and he looked at what came up. He stood up and looked at Gwen for a long moment. Then he said, "How do you set up the paddocks?" She walked him through the layout. He drove back to his ranch. He called her the following week and asked for the names of the fencing supplier and the research papers she had been reading. Let me tell you about the meeting at the Mosquero Community Center in November of 2013, because it is the part of this story that does not follow the script you might expect. The county extension agent had organized a range recovery forum. There were 34 ranchers in the folding chairs when Gwen arrived, and a NRCS range conservationist from the Las Vegas office was setting up a projector. The agenda was about emergency destocking and federal assistance programs and long-term seeding recovery on damaged range. Gwen had not been invited to speak. She was there as a rancher, the same as the others. But Lyle Trescott had called the extension agent the week before and said that before the forum got into seeding programs for dead range, maybe somebody ought to hear from a rancher in the county whose range was not dead, and could they give her 20 minutes. She stood up at the front of the room in her work jacket with the 3-ring binder and the printed paddock photographs, and she walked through 30 months of data in the way that she had always explained things, without drama, with numbers, looking at the room rather than at her notes. She showed the photographs side by side, the continuously grazed range in the county, alongside her own paddocks in the same drought months of the same years. She showed the weaning weights. She showed the bare ground percentages from her paddock measurements. She showed a letter from Tatum Ozel at NMSU describing the significance of her water infiltration data. The room was quiet when she finished, not the polite quiet of people being patient, the quiet of people recalculating. Wade Spurlock was in the third row. He was 63 years old and had seen more drought cycles than most of the people in that room. He had his arms crossed and he was looking at the paddock photographs on the wall behind her. Not at her. He did not ask a question. Lyle Trescott asked the first question. He asked about the labor cost of moving cattle every 7 to 10 days. She answered it. Then she answered 17 more questions, standing at the front of the room for 45 minutes past her 20-minute slot, while the NRCS conservationist sat to the side with his presentation still on the projector and the folding chairs creaked with ranchers leaning forward. Let me tell you about the morning Wade Spurlock drove out to the Alderman Ranch, because it is the part of this story that matters most. It was a February morning in 2014, 3 months after the forum, and Gwen was in the barn checking the water heater on the stock tank when she heard a truck on the caliche. She recognized it. She came out into the cold air and wiped her hands on her canvas work pants and stood in front of the barn. Wade Spurlock got out of his truck slowly. He was wearing his feed store jacket and his cap, and he looked at Gwen with an expression she had not seen on him before, which was the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a while and has decided to set it down. "I've got people asking me about that paddock system," he said. He set it to the ground between them. Gwen looked at him. She let the cold air sit between them for a moment. Not long. She was not a woman who made moments last longer than they needed to. Then she said, "Wade, you told me to let you know when I needed to move those pears in a hurry." She said it without anger. She said it the way you say a thing that is true and doesn't need decoration. "I know what I said," he said. "The thing I would tell your people," Gwen said, "is that the grass in this county is not dying because there are too many cattle. It's dying because the cattle never leave. A plant that gets grazed and never rests is a plant that is being asked to work without sleeping. You do that to a person long enough, they break. You do it to a grassland long enough, you get what we've got in this county. The drought didn't cause that. The drought just made it visible." She paused. "That's what I'd tell them." Wade Spurlock looked out at the paddocks. The grass was brown and short in February, the way grass is in February in New Mexico. But it was there. The plants were there. The bare ground that should have expanded through 3 drought years had not expanded. If you knew what you were looking for, the difference between those paddocks and the continuously grazed range to the north and east was not subtle. "You got something written up I could share," he said. She went inside and came back with a packet she had put together after the forum. The paddock photographs, the weaning data, the bare ground measurements, the NMSU letter, and a one-page summary she had written herself in plain language without jargon. She handed it to him at his truck. He took it. He drove back down the Kalish Road toward town. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because the story does not end in 2014. By 2016, 9 ranches in Harding County were running adaptive paddock systems. By 2018, Tatum Ozel at NMSU had included the Alderman Ranch in a published study on drought resilience in semi-arid shortgrass systems, citing 60 months of continuous paddock data from a working ranch, which was the kind of long-term field data that was difficult to generate in a university setting, and which Gwen had generated by getting down on one knee in her paddocks every month for 5 years and measuring the same things in the same way. The study was the first time Gwen's name appeared in a journal. She read it at the dining room table with Nora sitting across from her. She read it twice. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Your father would have liked this." Nora did not say anything either. She reached across the table and put her hand over her mother's hand for a moment. That was enough. Gwen was invited to speak at the New Mexico Stockmen's Conference in January of 2019. She drove down from Mosquero in the dark and arrived at the convention center before sunrise and sat in the parking garage for a few minutes before she went in, the same way she had sat in the truck after the feed store in 2011. Then she picked up her binder and went inside. She stood at the podium in a conference room with 280 ranchers and range professionals in the chairs, and she walked through 8 years of data the same way she always did it, without drama, with numbers looking at the room. Curtis Bale was in the 4th row. He had driven down that morning. When the applause started at the end, he stood up. He was the first person to stand, and he started clapping before most of the room had registered that the presentation was over. And when Gwen saw him from the podium, she stopped for just a moment and looked at him. Her son-in-law, who had helped her build 12,000 feet of polywire fence in a drought year, who had told her he wanted it on record, that he thought they would regret it, who had not once in 8 years said "I told you so," because there was nothing to tell. She did not try to say anything. She let the room do what it was doing. Let me tell you about the fall of 2022, because that is where this story earns its ending. Gwen was 65 years old and had been managing the Alderman Ranch on the paddock system for 11 years. Curtis and Nora were running the day-to-day work, and Gwen was the one who walked the paddocks every morning, the same way Ray had walked the fences when they were first married, looking at things slowly and with purpose. Their son, Marcus, their younger daughter's boyfriend, let me be exact about this. Nora and Curtis had a son named Eli, who was 19 years old, had come back from his first year at New Mexico State with a minor in range science and a head full of questions about soil carbon sequestration and the intersection of adaptive grazing and carbon markets. He came to the table one evening in October with a printed research paper and a notebook and said he wanted to talk about enrolling the ranch in a rangeland carbon protocol and generating revenue from the soil carbon that the paddock system had been building for 11 years. Gwen looked at the notebook. She looked at the paper. She looked at her grandson across the table. She did not ask him how old he was. She did not ask him what his neighbors would think. She said, "Walk me through the numbers." Ely opened his notebook and started talking, and Gwen listened the way she had always listened to the land, with her full attention and without the weight of 11 years of doing it one way pressing down on every word he said. Curtis was sitting at the end of the table with his coffee. He listened too. After a while, he looked at his mother-in-law, and something passed between them that did not need to be spoken. Let me tell you one last thing, because it is the thing this story is actually about. The South Paddock on the Alderman Ranch, Paddock 14, the one where Lyle Trescott got down on his knee in September of 2013 and dug his fingers into the ground, has never been continuously grazed again. Gwen photographs it on the first of every month with the same camera at the same angle. The photographs are in a binder on the shelf in the dining room next to Ray's old ranch journals. In 2022, 11 years after Gwen strung the first polywire across that pasture during the worst drought the county had seen in 40 years, the bare ground between plants in Paddock 14 measures 8%. When she started, it measured 34%. The neighboring ranches that destocked aggressively in 2011 and 2012 and let their range rest the conventional way, without grazing, without the disturbance that the grasses had evolved alongside, are still recovering. Some of them are better. None of them are what they were. Wade Spurlock retired in 2017. He came to one of the pasture walks Gwen hosted for county ranchers in 2016, 3 years before he retired, and he stood at the back of the group and listened, and looked at the paddock photographs taped to the fence posts. He asked one question about the labor cost of moving cattle in winter. Gwen answered it. Nobody made anything of the fact that he was there. That was right. Gwen Alderman still ranches the same 4,200 acres. She still carries the binder. Eli is in his second year studying the carbon data, and the numbers are beginning to say something worth saying. And Paddock 14, the one everyone said she'd be forced to abandon when the drought got bad enough, is in its 12th rotation. The blue grama in it is as dense as anything in the county. In a wet September, it comes back so fast it is almost startling, the way things come back when they have been given real rest and real time. She refused to destock when they told her to. They shook their heads. The drought came, the cattle held, the grass came back, and the binder was right all along.